Great colleagues that are here in the audience and everybody following us online. I would like to again welcome you to the second live STIAS webinar, and we're pleased that this afternoon we'll have Professor Ian Goldin leading us in the discussion on the pandemic that changed the world. So I would like to welcome all of you and also to welcome in a special way fellows, colleagues and friends joining us both here and online. The procedure as usual for the webinar, I'll do the initial introduction both for the fellows present and also for the webinar presenter, and then Christoph will, after the presentation, Christoph will manage the Q&A, and we looking very much forward to the presentation as it is going to unfold. So Ian, welcome. But before I introduce you, I would like to mention that this week we will have two fellows in residence will be leaving. We'll have Stephanie Plough and Rob Terrell will be leaving us shortly, I think tomorrow, but we're sure that they're going to come back one of these days. Rob has been, working on the private office, and we will continue to be hooked to him in terms of who makes policy and who lights the sun. Stephanie, we wish you all the best in your work on marine mammals and ocean health, and look forward to the network that is going to come out of that particular work. So in the next 7 days, I think we're going to have another crop of fellows coming in, so it's going to be active again. And for today, we're going to address the issue of the pandemic that changed the world. If I may say just one or two things before I introduce Ian, our speaker this afternoon. We all are relieved that now we're at level 1 of the pandemic. Since 27th March, and it's 6 months since we were locked down, and I really want to thank everybody for the perseverance and being as alive as they are. But of course, as we move into the lifting of the restrictions, we are always worried about the what if, what Europe now is going through with the second wave and things. And so we are reminded of the author of the high fantasy works, The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, Tolkien, who said, never laugh at live dragons. So as long as this thing is live, you never laugh at live dragons. But of course, we also take heed of writer Marden Dodevic's observation that fear of the unknown will always be overpowered by human desire toward exploration. And its curiosity is the risk whose gift often pays off. So Ian will lead us in also exploring these ways of making sure that it will always be overpowered. Hopefully, it will always be overpowered by human desire toward exploration. And in this spirit of exploration is where STIAS is also engaged in combining the various platforms in bringing together the fellows, former, current, and future, in engaging in this exploration adventure, if I may call it that way. So in today's seminar, Ian Goldin speaks to this unprecedented pandemic presentation, and the leaflet that was given out does indicate a bit of what Ian is. And so suffice it to note that Professor Ian Goldin is a professor of globalization and development at the University of Oxford and the director of the Oxford Martin Program on Technological and Economic Change. He was the founding director of the Oxford Martin School. He's also a permanent fellow of STIAS, and in that role, he plays an ambassadorial role of what STIAS stands for and has to offer to the scholarly world, as well as for the artists in residence that do spend time here and continue to engage with us. Ian has served as a non-executive director on the boards of a number of leading businesses, including Old Mutual, Implenia AG, Metropolitan Life, and CDC PLC. He was chief executive and managing director of the Development Bank of Southern Africa and served as an advisor to President Nelson Mandela. He has worked in executive positions at the World Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in London, and the OECD Development Center in Paris. He's extensively published and has been hosted by major broadcasters, including the BBC. His non-profit activities, including being chair of the COA Econ Initiative to reform global economics and serving as a trustee of Comic Relief and other charities. He was knighted by the French government and nominated as Global Leader of Tomorrow by the World Economic Forum. In addition to today's webinar, we are all excited about his new book, which he has co-authored with Robert Maga, titled Terra Incognita, 100 Maps to Survive the Next 100 Years. And I'm sure that all of us hooked up do want to survive for the next 100 years. And this book has already received great reviews. And if I may refer to one of the review by Chris Anderson, the New York Times best-selling author of TED Talks. He has said, amidst an abundance of global crisis and unrest, it's easy to feel as if there's no prescription for the future. But Terra Incognita provides us with just that, through stunning maps and visual aids that illuminate the most pressing issues of our world. So I would like to present Professor Ian Goldin to lead us in this presentation this afternoon. And I'm sure that we're going to have several questions, especially given that we all want to live 100 years from now. Thank you very much. And Ian, it's you. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me, see me? Thank you very much, Professor Kirumira. It's delightful to see you there, and my only sorrow today is that I'm not with you at STIAS in your wonderful surroundings and part of that incredible community that you've created to bring great people together to think of the key issues that we face. I'm very happy to be one of the unpaid ambassadors for STIAS as I live and work in Oxford and travel elsewhere, because I do believe it's a really exceptional place, and it's always been a treat to be there. I hope to be back there in 2021. What I would like to share with you today is some thoughts which arise out of working on Terra Incognita, and also on a BBC series that I did, which was broadcast, is on the World Service website in July this year, which was entitled the same as that of my talk today, The Pandemic That Changed the World. And it's out of that that I am now reflecting on the many ways in which this has fundamentally transformed the world, and has led me to believe that we are at an inflection point in world history. This is the biggest thing that's happened in all of our lifetimes, I think. and it will have repercussions, will determine our futures, wherever we are. It's also the biggest development disaster that's happened in our lifetimes. And for anyone that cares about development, about the progress of humanity around the world, this is a time for grave concern. Nevertheless, it's also a time for hope, and the changes which have occurred in our own lives, our behavioral changes, in the way that governments are responding, not all of them, but some of them, in the way that we've come to reevaluate our priorities, and the sacrifices that so many have made, not least the young for the old, I believe does give cause for immense optimism. And so what I hope to share with you over the next 40 minutes or so is different dimensions of this, and then I very much look forward to the questions and answers. What you should have, and I'm just seeing, do you have my slides up now? Is the outline of what I hope to cover, and these are the areas. I'll go through a very wide range of issues, and hopefully in the conversation we'll be able to drill down on any of the areas you feel require further attention. And certainly they all do, and indeed this is all going to build out. Each of these is a chapter in a new book that I'm working on, and many of these issues are covered in Terra Incognita, which incidentally I understand will be in exclusives bookshops in South Africa pretty soon, in a couple of weeks' time. The first question is, why do we have this pandemic? And my own view is that this arises inevitably out of globalization. I've been predicting it every year since 2013. My book, The Butterfly Defect, the subtitle of which is Why Globalization Creates Systemic Risks and What to Do About It, said very clearly that a pandemic was not only inevitable, but would lead to a global financial crisis. That message has been repeated in my subsequent work, and the final episode of another BBC series I did after the crash in 2018, I said this would be the source of the next crisis. Of course, it wasn't only me that was saying this. Many, many others, and certainly anyone that knows about pandemics was arguing this. And so too were Bill Gates and many other people. The surprise isn't that we've had this pandemic. The surprise is that we were so surprised by it, unprepared for it, that we didn't do anything to stop it. And that, I believe, is a lesson which needs to be learned, because if it's not, we're due for even worse pandemics in the future. As you'll know from the mortality rates in South Africa and elsewhere, this pandemic, by historical standards, although it's been highly contagious, has not been associated with very high levels of mortality compared to some earlier pandemics, and certainly not compared to Ebola or the Spanish flu of 1918. Not only, if we hear the lessons, are we due for more pandemics, but of course various other catastrophes, including climate change. So this is a wake-up call, I hope. I hope it will be the pandemic to end all pandemics. But that should not be done by creating islands, countries which are insulated from each other, because that would only aggravate the problem. There is no wall high enough that can keep out a pandemic or climate change or any of the other great threats to our future. But what those high walls do keep out is the ideas, the technologies, including vaccines, scientific collaboration, and much else for clean energy and other areas, the investments, the jobs, the export opportunities, the tourism, the remittances, and the other things that we desperately need around the world, not least in South Africa, in order to progress. And so if the lesson of this pandemic is taken, as many have taken it to be, that we need less globalization, not more, that would be a grave mistake, because what we need is, more than anything, better regulated globalization and a globalization which encompasses politics. It's the disconnect between globalization of goods and services and globalization of politics that has led us to where we are today. It's the failure to invest in international institutions. It's the failure to invest adequately in what's needed to stop the bads of globalization. Because the super spreaders of the goods, like airport hubs, are also the super spreaders of the bads, like pandemics. Financial centers allow us to do international financial transactions and investments and trade, but they also lead to cascading financial crises. Cyber centers allow us to communicate and allow us to have this remote seminar, but they also lead to the spreading of cyber viruses and fake news. Fake news can be spread, but so too can the Me Too movement or Black Lives Matter. And all of these platforms of globalization spread good and bad. And it's a question of how they managed, how they regulated, not whether they should be there in the first place, in my view. And of course, good things can lead to bad things in globalization too. It's wonderful that so many people around the world have energy for the first time, although there's still 700 million people in Africa that don't yet have reliable energy. But that same increase in energy consumption and transport and travel, cooking, refrigerators, microwaves, and everything else has led to an escalation of climate change and severe emergency in terms of that and associated risks for the planet. It's great that so many people are taking antibiotics around the world. This is improving health. And yet we know that antibiotic resistance is a growing threat to all of us. It's not that we should stop antibiotics or stop energy use. We need to do these things in effective ways that do not harm ourselves and the planet. And so the great question for globalization is not whether it should be stopped, but how it should be managed. What type of globalization do we want? And what the pandemic has revealed is not, as many have argued, that globalization will be stopped or even reversed, but actually, in many respects, the pandemic is accelerating it. Certainly, when I speak to my colleagues in Oxford, who are in science and medicine, they say they've never been more actively collaborative with others around the world as they search for a vaccine, and Oxford certainly has one that it's hopeful about. And, of course, in the sequencing of the genomes of COVID-19 as it mutates around the world. Digital traffic is over double the level it was a year ago, and that's a vital aspect of globalization. Over 100 countries are going to need bailouts from international institutions, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But increased capital flows, both official and private, is another likely consequence. So too is increased flow of many other dimensions of globalization, and I believe we'll see a rebound in those. Some, like business travel, might be permanently dislocated, lower levels of growth going forward, and that's good because of the efficiency, carbon emission, and cost savings that would be associated with that. But others, like supply chain transformations, were happening anyway. And that's not because the pandemic is leading to a reversal, but it's accelerating and compressing underlying trends, not least the trend towards automation. It's accelerating the automation of work processes that would have happened anyway. And increasingly, we are seeing a reshoring of automated processes with very significant consequences for development. Because what are the 10 million people a year coming onto the labor market in Africa going to be doing if the middle rungs of the development ladder, which were always the path to labor-intensive, low and medium-skilled jobs, are removed? Not only in production of garments or other manufactured products, which increasingly are automated, but also in services, call centers, which are being automated now too, back offices of legal firms, of financial services, of others. And so this poses fundamental questions for the future of development. The difference between the impact of the pandemic on the young and the old has been dramatic. And in many senses, what we're seeing in this pandemic is a sacrifice of the young for the old and an increase in inequality. The reason why the pandemic is leading to an increase in inequality within countries and between countries is because those who can work remotely and those that are benefited tend to be the wealthier people. My job has not been affected, and we see STIAS continuing. But those in hospitality industries, those who have to go to work to get an income, often in the informal sector, are highly affected. And so we see a global reproduction of what is true in the US depicted in this graphic, where the higher the share of shutdown services, the lower the incomes of people. And that aggravates income inequality within countries dramatically. The top 10% of earners have not been largely affected. 90% of them have continued with the same levels of income, whereas the bottom 20% have seen over a 50% reduction in income in the US and in Europe. And the numbers in many developing countries are even more stark. There's also a highly skewed age distribution of this, because younger people have been more affected than older people, and women have been more affected than men. We see that the share of people working in shutdown areas is much greater amongst the young, and women are more vulnerable too, because they are more represented in hospitality, airline, and other services which have been heavily disrupted. And this is skewing existing imbalances in society further. It's leading to an intergenerational and gender inequality, which is even worse than it was before. And this will be compounded by the joblessness facing young people who are sacrificing everything. Young people have a very low likelihood of death from COVID-19. In the UK, the figures are that you're more likely to be struck by lightning as a young person than to die of COVID-19. And as you know, in the UK, we don't have much lightning. So it's a very, very low risk for young people around the world. And yet they're sacrificing their jobs, they're sacrificing their social lives, they're sacrificing their studies in order to protect the elderly, who are much more vulnerable. And this intergenerational sacrifice is one with immense consequences for the long term, not least because people have lost out years of schooling, at least a year of schooling in many places. Over 1.3 billion children around the world have had schools closed for some time, and 463 million children have no remote learning at all. For wealthier families, there's homeschooling, parents, teachers at good schools still engaging with their pupils remotely. But for poor kids with bad internet connectivity that share a room with family who are unable to work, who cannot escape, often very, very dysfunctional family relationships, this time is a disaster with long-term damage. UNICEF estimates that 23 million children will never return to school after this pandemic is over, and they are permanently scarred. But others that have lost out on schooling will also be scarred, not only by their missed schooling or university studies, but by the state of the job market, which has got much more severe. In the UK, in the US, and even worse, in poorer countries and in South Africa, the opportunities for school leavers and for young people have collapsed. And this, of course, is a very worrying thing. In addition to all of this, young people are inheriting a much greater debt. And that will have to be repaid by future generations. In the UK, debt has gone up to the highest level since the Second World War. The same is happening in the US and around the world. Over $13 trillion worth of debt. Many countries, well over 10% of GDP in new debt, which will be repaid by future generations. And so the inequalities are on multiple dimensions. The inequalities of gender, the inequalities of age, and of course the inequalities of race. Not only in South Africa, but also around the world. The data from the US is stark on this, where the people with the lowest income and the highest mortality rates are most vulnerable are Black, Asian, and other ethnic minorities. In the UK, we see over double the mortality rates for these groups as we do in the US as well. And that's a combination of living in areas and homes which are more crowded, having facilities and hospitals which are less effective, and having comorbidities like diabetes and other comorbidities which lead to higher mortality. And so far from this pandemic being an equal opportunity pandemic, although the virus is indiscriminate in who it attacks, it is having immense differential consequences and heightening existing inequalities within societies. You also see it heightening inequalities by levels of education and by location where people are, with much greater impact in dense, poor urban areas than elsewhere. And of course, what you see is an immense impact on firms. Where firms are affected, it tends to be through government policies, either saving them or allowing them to go to ground. The rich countries have allocated $13 trillion to protecting their firms and protecting workers through various forms of insurance or protection to remain at work, furlough schemes. That is about 4 times the total economy size, GDP size of the whole of Africa. It's unimaginable for poor countries to begin to compete or to emulate the levels of support that have been provided by rich countries to their own people. And yet, what we see is the need has never been greater. When you look at the impact of the fiscal balances of different countries. You see that over the long period of time from 2006, we're seeing this massive expansion. And this was at the beginning of the pandemic. It has now got much, much bigger. And so the levels of debt are comparable to those of the wars. And in the UK, my feeling is that they will go even further in terms of a share of GDP. The bailouts to business are unprecedented as well. In Germany, for example, and in the UK, there's basically a policy of not allowing firms to go bankrupt by supporting them in a variety of ways. At an immense cost, 34% of GDP is estimated to be the cost of this in Germany, 15% in the UK. Through a variety of different actions, interest-free loans, moratoriums on paying tax, support through procurement, paying for workers, variety of different measures have been implemented, and the US has different measures again. But none of these are affordable, and all of them will have to be paid back. They are postponing, not stopping, the pain that will come out of the crisis. The hope, of course, of governments is that there'll be a rebound, and that after that rebound, these firms will be restored to their health. But my own view is that that is overly optimistic. It also begs the question of should governments intervene in this way? One of the many taboos that's been broken by COVID-19 is what governments should do. This is going way beyond what even Keynes imagined. The pendulum has swung in the most dramatic way from the Thatcher-Reagan era of governments being small and getting out of economic activity, the role of business being business, to a period when governments have a much wider mandate and businesses too are seen to have wider responsibilities than simply making profits. We're moving towards a corporatist world, a world in which civil servants and politicians decide which firms will win and which firms will lose. And in that world, there's plenty of room for mistakes and corruption. There's also room, of course, to pour money into bottomless pits, and consumers don't necessarily gain. But it's a very different world from the world of January this year. It's a very different world in which governments were saying they didn't have the money in the rich countries to do anything, that they were in austerity. This is the opposite. How it will impact in the longer term on productivity growth and on other debates is the key question. And my hope is that it transforms into a view that we can have a Green New Deal, for example, where governments invest massively in jobs and in businesses to create a zero carbon future. But how that plays out will depend on the different politicians' views. The more stringent the lockdown, the greater the damage to economies. And of course, this was something that was done in countries in order to try and arrest the progress of the virus, not least in South Africa, but not only in South Africa. Fiscal stimulus has not been available to most except Malaysia of poor countries in the scale that it has been elsewhere. And here you see on the bottom axis the size of the fiscal stimulus against the stringency. This has dramatic consequences because countries which have closed that down through lockdown, through stringency of lockdown, and who are able to do fiscal stimulus have much lesser impact than those like South Africa or India, where you have very strong lockdown and very weak, relatively, compared to the richer countries' fiscal stimulus. And it's that which leads to massive levels of unemployment and, of course, greatly escalates poverty. One of the other great transformations has been the move to remote work. A lot of debate about whether this will be permanent or not, and to what extent we will see the end of the office. My own view is that this is a fundamental shift. The taboo on working from home, that people that worked at home were slacking in some way, the whole idea of being present or presenteeism, I think has been broken permanently. And I think we will see a dramatic change for those sectors that can go online in remote work. It saves money, it's good for the health of employees often, and it will lead to dramatic repricing of office space and home space. Not everyone can work remotely. And of course, the more crowded your home conditions, and often younger people suffer more from this, the more disconnected your internet is, the more people have to share it, the less privacy you have, and the more that your job does not allow it, that is not an option. And so we will see very differentiated economies with some who have to go to work and others who can stay at home. That will create a new class. There will be more wealth distributed into commuter land and suburbs, people staying home or further afield, and city centers will become poorer as a result. In the short term, there does not appear to have been a productivity decline for those that can work from home. Indeed, in the US, 9 billion hours of time were saved in the first 7 months of the pandemic through lack of commuting, of which about a third went into work, working extra hours. And it could be that productivity and output is up in the short term. But a key question is the longer term consequences of this and the extent to which innovation, creativity, sparking the sorts of things that happen at STIAS and at the Oxford Martin School by people coming together, how that will be negatively affected. There are a lot of advantages in Zoom and efficiency advantages, but there are a lot of disadvantages in remote meetings too. And they include lack of spontaneity, the reinforcement of hierarchies, and a very difficult to develop social cultures and creative, unintended, serendipitous conversations. Those that have existing networks and existing ideas can pursue them without much difficulty. But creating new ideas and bringing new people and new cultures into an organization is very difficult remotely. It's also, incidentally, very difficult in terms of overcoming political obstacles. You don't have, as the musical Hamilton famously coined, being in the room moments where that spark is between people that overcome barriers to create new activities, as has happened so many times in history. Commuting is going down dramatically, and that is good. It's good for pollution, it's good in other ways, and it was happening anyway, but has been accelerated. And the hours saved are being distributed across work and leisure activities. It's been quite remarkable looking at the online searches for different things. And of course, what we've seen is bubbles in different activities, not least in home, gym equipment, baking equipment, gardening equipment, entertainment, Netflix, and so on. But the ability to do that depends critically on one's income, whether one has space at home, whether one has an office or a place to do exercise, and the other opportunities that come with that. Do you have the ingredients for new foodstuffs? And how does this affect single people? Where we see a huge increase in loneliness and dramatically worrying figures on mental health, suicide, and other areas of destabilizing activity. It's a terrible time to be on your own. It's a terrible time to be in mourning for a loved one. It's a terrible time to be unemployed. It's a terrible time for those that don't already have a possibility. And that is likely to lead to a very rapidly degenerating situation, socially and politically. When we think about the impact of this, it's particularly developing countries that I worry about. COVID-19 has led to the reversal of the gains in development, which were achieved in the post-war period and particularly accelerated over the last 30 years. It's led to by far the most rapid increase in hunger, in poverty, and in other indicators of deprivation. And of course, it's made attaining the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN unachievable on many dimensions. Even those where it seemed there would be achievements have been set back. Of course, data collection has suffered as well as part of this. And so in many respects, we don't know how bad the situation is. These are the World Bank's forecasts, and you see the decline that was predicted in poverty being dramatically reversed. And as the pandemic is not yet over and we don't know the full implications, it's difficult to judge this. Now, while the rich countries have given $13 trillion to themselves, they've given less than 100 billion to countries in need around the world, less than 1%. And this failure to understand common humanity, this failure to support those in need, is in dramatic contrast to the post-war period, Second World War, and even to the financial crisis, where there was a massive rallying convened by the G8, George W. Bush at the time, and then Gordon Brown with the G20 to support developing countries. This has been a total failure of leadership and of governance from the rich countries. The IMF has over 100 countries that have applied for money, but it does not have the ability to give on the terms that are needed and the debt reductions which are required. In fact, there needs to be another massive debt write-off going beyond what was achieved in HIPC in the 1990s. To make matters worse, the credit rating agencies are saying if people accept these debt write-offs, their credit will be downgraded. And so many countries are very nervous and are keeping going to the market because they don't want to have their credit rating undermined. Over 16 African countries went to the markets over the last decade, and the credit rating agencies are saying to them, if you accept a bailout, you'll be downgraded. This, I believe, is a scandal, because this is what we would call a force majeure or exceptional circumstance. And that countries are being blamed for it is very worrying. If you rank developing countries on their financial strength, as has been done in this graphic, you see all the red is what's worrying. And over 30 countries are in an absolutely perilous state in this. And of course, South Africa's finances are also concerning. Many African countries have gone to Eurobond markets and have to repay their bonds over the coming years. And so this credit rating agency and the ability of this to be renegotiated is absolutely crucial. I'm beginning to run out of time, so let me briefly touch on a couple of other topics, and then if you're interested, we can come back to them in discussion. The first is, what does this all mean for the future of climate change? My own view is that the jury is out on this, as on many other issues. We have seen a dramatic decline of between 5 and 10% in carbon emissions over the last year, as many industries have closed down Airline traffic has closed down. That accounts for about 2%. And we've seen much less car traffic. But based on the 2008 experience, 9 financial crisis experience, this will rebound and could rebound in a much worse way, because the stimulus packages are being spent on construction and infrastructure, which means more cement, which is one of the biggest carbon emitters. It's also the case that Brazil has seen a massive increase in deforestation due to a combination of Bolsonaro, the president's deregulating ambitions and weakness of enforcement being made even weaker by the inability of those that are responsible for enforcement to patrol and to stop deforestation, even where there's a political will, which there is in some of the states and supported on by some of the NGO projects. So deforestation rates are higher than ever. The Amazon is burning, and with that, carbon emissions are going up. And so we have this trade-off between short and long term, and unless we see this as an ability, as a time to invest in a Green New Deal, unless we see the message of the pandemic as being we can change our behavior if we want to for social good, and governments can find the money if they want to in the national interest, and unless we develop more international solidarity and create Green New Deals, I do not see the pandemic as doing anything other than accelerating climate change. It already, of course, has led to a postponement of COP26, which was scheduled in November this year. Finally, what do we learn from history about where we are and what's likely to happen in the future? For me, the closest analogy is that of the world wars. And the key question is, are we in the First World War or the Second World War? Now, as you know, the First World War was truly devastating. But what came out of it through misguided leadership was even more devastating. Nationalism, recriminations on those that were defeated, failure to take forward the League of Nations, austerity programs, reparations, led to the Great Depression, the rise of populism, fascism, and of course, an even worse war, the Second World War, in which over 60 million people lost their lives. That war had a very different process involved in it. It was the war that ended world wars. During the midst of the war, while the bombs were literally dropping on the buildings in which the civil servants worked, while they were fighting a war on 5 fronts, the leaders, Roosevelt and Churchill, had the vision to create a new world order. Together with Stalin and many others, they created the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions, the seeds of the Marshall Plan, and of course Beveridge in 1942, in the middle of the war, the welfare state. These were revolutionary activities, but they were activities that were informed by the view not only of the leaders, but the pressure from society that the sacrifices of young people should not be in vain, that the awful devastation that had occurred should never happen again. The lessons were learned that this could only work if it worked internationally, which is why those that were most affected, like Germany and Japan, by the bombings, were reached out to and given the greatest resources. When I went to the World Bank after being the chief executive of the Development Bank of Southern Africa, I went to Japan to sign and receive the final payment of the final loan that had been given by the World Bank in the 1950s to Japan for the construction of trains, which were way ahead of their time. And in that, I recognized the solidarity that had been shown to former enemies. And my question today is, where is this today? The geopolitics of today is extremely worrying. We have a critical election in the US on November the 3rd, and we see the tendency towards rising nationalism in many countries. That would be a death knell for all of us, because the only way that we can create a better world out of this pandemic is by developing coalitions that address the key issues, by reinforcing the international institutions that manage these risks, by the cities, companies, countries working together to address the critical challenges we face. This doesn't require everyone to do everything. It requires that people in their own communities, in their own lives, do what they can, and that the leaders of their countries do what they can within their capabilities. This pandemic has taught us another remarkable thing, which is those with the biggest expertise, the most money, don't necessarily do the best. The US has been firmly removed from its pedestal as the #1 country, yet it still is in science, and it still is the richest country in the world. But it has managed the pandemic so appallingly, and so too has the UK. Within Europe, Greece, which is regarded as by many as one of the least capable countries with the weakest governments and has one of the lowest levels of income in Europe, did the best on the pandemic. Less than 300 deaths in total. In the UK, we've had that many deaths on the worst days in half a day. Mongolia's had virtually no deaths. Vietnam, 1. Poor countries who've done remarkably well. And of course, China, under the circumstances, has done well too. What these countries have in common is a solidarity of people for each other, a respect for particularly the international rules. They listened to the WHO. They didn't think they knew better. And in that, they were able to do things that much richer and more powerful countries were not able to do. And so, for me, another key lesson of this is the social cohesion we have in our societies and our trust in each other and our trust in our ability to be guided by international norms and regulations has proven to be an effective safeguard for our own futures. So as we look forward, for me, there's no doubt that nothing will be the same. The taboos are broken. We can no longer say governments cannot afford to do X, Y, or Z, or we cannot change our behavior. The question is how these get translated into an international context, whether we end up with a more divided and fragmented dystopian world, where we're unable to manage pandemics and climate change and other threats. Rising inequality leads to more divisions within countries and between countries, or whether this pandemic creates a portal to a new world of sustainable and inclusive development. Thank you.
Ian, thank you so very, very much for that extremely carefully nuanced exposition of where we are and what we face as humanity. That's a poignant question. Are we in World War I or are we in World War II? So good afternoon, everyone. For the sake of the online audience, let me just introduce myself. I'm Christoph Poe. I'm the program manager at STIAS. It's my privilege to guide the Q&A after this presentation by Ian. First of all, thank you very, very much, Ian, for agreeing to present this afternoon. Thanks also for the audience who's joined us, those who are here, and the over 100 audience members online. So all of them friends or fellows or university colleagues from here or other universities in the country and worldwide. It's wonderful to have this opportunity. We'll structure the Q&A as follows. We'll take one or two questions from the audience in the room here. We'll switch the camera to the audience so that Ian gets to see a little bit of us here as well. And then we'll go to some of those questions that have been posted online. We probably will not be able to go through all the online questions. I'll read a couple of those questions to which Ian will respond. And we'll come back to the room as questions in the room may arise. So for the audience in the room, then let me turn the camera around. There you go, Ian, you can see where we are.
I'm sorry, I'm not there.
Let me see by show of hands one or two questions. We'll start with Deborah Shepherd. When you raised your question, I suggest you stand up and just raise your voice a little bit so that we make sure that microphone picks up.
Okay. Hi, Ian. Thank you very much. That was wonderfully encompassing. And the whole time I was thinking about the role of trust and social cohesion. So I was so happy to hear you come to that in your conclusion, because I think that plays an important role. And I think something that also came up a lot for me was this notion of measurement. So your whole presentation was measurement.
Sorry, Christoph, I can't hear the question.
Assessment of what has happened in the US and the UK, sort of the world leaders compared to the poorer, less developed countries, death and aging of the virus, in your key measurements. And I was just wondering, is maybe our sort of new order moving out of this something to do with out of World War II as institutions? I'm just thinking, the way we make these comparisons is measurements, sort of the way we think about measuring things in economics, something that could emerge, a change in that. So I was just thinking about the QLFS for South Africa was released today, and it showed a decrease in unemployment. And that's just because more people have moved into non-economic activity. Now, if you put that statistic in the hand of some leaders, they would jump onto that and say, look, COVID-19 reduced our unemployment rate, without giving much attention to what the denominator of that measure is. So I'm just trying to think, what can you learn about measurements? The way we compare economies and the way we compare the effects of these types of economic shocks and social shocks moving forward.
Thanks, Ian. You picked that up. You can go ahead.
Yeah, it sort of faded in and out, so I'm not sure I got the whole question, but I think I gather what it was about, and maybe for the next question, someone could speak closer to the mic or something. But the question on measurement and how it's changed. I think one of the first casualties of any pandemic of this nature is statistics and measurement. We're seeing that around the world, and it has quite severe consequences in some places, like the US, for example. You get all sorts of selection bias because people who are most vulnerable are less likely to come to the door or to fill in forms or to be available, etc. And some areas, and including climate, incidentally, there's all sorts of monitoring that's just not happening. In the forests of the Amazon, but in many other places. So the ships that normally go around and the airplanes that normally go around as the biggest atmospheric measurement tools are not going around in the same way. And so our understanding of the atmosphere has been greatly reduced by the pandemic. So there are many things, and I think it's true in, if I understood the question or heard the question regarding unemployment, informal sector, and activities, that there's massive mismeasurement. I mean, we have no idea in the UK or in the US what the levels will be, because or in Europe, such a high share of people are being sustained in zombie firms, what are thought of as zombie firms, because they don't have any business going, but people are still on payroll to some extent. And what will happen to them as these schemes end, which a lot of them are ending in October, is a big question. So I think we'll see a massive jump in unemployment. It's also the case that a lot of people have to sign on for unemployment. You have to go to an unemployment center and sign on physically still and present yourself and show yourself. And to the extent that those centers are closed, that people cannot sign on online. And even if people can sign on online, a lot of people who are disempowered in various ways or don't have the equipment in various ways, don't have a computer or phone, cannot sign on. So there is a massive measurement problem, which is heavily biased and which I think overrepresents the extent to which people have stayed in employment, which aren't dislocated, and the informal sector. No one knows what the size of the informal sector is. I've seen massive variance, even for a rich country like Italy, let alone to South Africa or others. But many would suggest it's up to 50% of the economy. And in that environment, in many African countries, of course, there's no safety net. In India, by the way, it's also regarded as about 50% of employment. And there's very little data around that. So absolutely, measurement is a massive issue and has got a lot worse. I hope that answered at least part of your question, which I couldn't really hear.
Thanks, Ian. We'll go to the first question on the Q&A under the Publish tab. You'll see there's a question from Anonymous. You did speak to this somewhat, maybe you can add a word or two. The question is, are we going to see the revival of the post-war Keynesian state and the end of neoliberalism?
Yeah, can I just share a slide with you and other participants again on this?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, let's see if you got that slide. What you see on this slide is the appetite for change. And it's quite remarkable that around the world, over 3/4 of people want significant change in the way that things are run in the future to be more sustainable and more equitable. So people are not saying we want to bounce back, or let me just share one more slide. That, by the way, is my Twitter address and website if you want further information. And now I will end the sharing if I can. And so I can see myself and you again. What you're seeing around the world is a real appetite for, sorry, let me just get that up and stop the sharing. Okay. What you're seeing is a huge appetite for change. And we're also seeing on the part of governments actions which are totally incompatible with neoliberalism, whether it's the sustaining of firms, which was would make Milton Friedman, turn in his grave, or whether it's basically paying firms to keep people employed or just printing money, we are in a totally different macroeconomic and microeconomic environment. There's also, by the way, the end of competition policy, because governments are basically running a lot of processes, not only in South Africa, but globally, without proper procurement. And political power has become much more corporatist in that respect. So yes, I think there's a real potential for a dramatic swing, and there's certainly a hunger from the public for that. And as well, I think what we're seeing is there's on the side of not only on pandemic, but also on climate change, a much greater recognition. We see businesses increasingly saying their business is no longer shareholders, but stakeholders. What isn't clear is whether this is going to be sustained. And, you know, in after the Second World War, it clearly was, and we saw the creation of massive welfare state. But then there were two freedoms that governments had. They could repress interest rates, and they could have inflation, which lowered the debt. And so by 1960, debts were down to below pre-war levels. That can't happen now for two reasons. One is the interest rates being so low and central banks independent. And that means that we are stuck with these very high levels of debt, which leads governments to another option, which is austerity, basically. Of course, they could have another option, which is tax, more taxes, higher taxes, more revenue and more expenditure. And that needs to happen. One of the huge growths in inequality out of this crisis has been of the ultra-wealthy companies and individuals. Jeff Bezos has made another $22,000 a second since the crisis began. Because, you know, he's very happy that everyone's gone online and doing online shopping. We're owning Amazon, or a big chunk of Amazon. But Google, Facebook, and other companies are also having record times. And so if you look at the wealth of the richest billionaires in the world, it's gone up something like 14% during the pandemic, while the wealth of the bottom 50% of the world has gone down by over 20%. So this widening inequality, I believe, is part of the widening anger, and it's going to be added to by the revelation that President Trump has paid $750 or something taxes in 2 years and nothing in the previous decade, in the past decade. So I think people will say we need a different model. And I think that will be translated into taxpayers' views. And I think we will see more Keynesian action in the rich countries. The challenge for countries like South Africa and developing countries is there's no fiscal space. You know, the options that are open in rich countries to print money, to borrow, and basically the central banks to buy government bonds, to just print more money with no real consequences, are not open to developing countries. And so while the rich countries can double their debts, and we've seen Japan do that, and no effect on its financial stability. We're seeing it in Europe. We saw it after the wars, and we're seeing it again. South Africa does not have that option, and nor does any other developing country. And that means that we need much more international solidarity if that's to be a global model. There needs to be a much transfer from richer countries to poorer countries. Much stronger global institutions to support that. So yes, I think there will be a swing to it, and that is already happening. There's a risk that in some countries, if Trump was re-elected, we could see austerity again in the US. This government in the UK, you don't know what they're doing from one day to the next, but I would not rule out austerity as the future. But it's not going to happen across Europe in Southern European countries or in Germany. It could happen in the Netherlands and in some of the Benelux countries. And then the big question is what happens to developing countries.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. We have a question in the room here, so let me ask JP to come forward. JP Smith. Is somebody Paul miskien?
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. I was interested in your remark on the ratings agencies. So I'm not an economist, I don't understand this stuff terribly well. I would just like to hear the pushback against the argument I hear very confidently. So the argument is the ratings agencies systemic sort of proxy. They're supposed to tell us will a country repay its debt or not. And so if a country does take a write-off, then it does indicate relative to a country that doesn't, far less likely to pay. I think of, say, two people, all else being equal, I'll offer them a write-off, the one takes it or none. I'm definitely more likely to lean to the first one, right? It shows a confidence, a commitment, a history of financial sort of good decisions. So if we just treat them as a sort of epistemic proxy, why is that a terrible argument?
Yeah, sorry, what's happening with these questions is it's loud at the beginning and then it suddenly gets softer. Maybe there's some, so the middle of your thing faded out and I picked up the beginning and end. The credit rating agencies, well, there's lots of issues around credit rating agencies, and as we've seen with this absolute disaster with Wirecard in Germany, but as we saw with Enron and as what we've seen with many companies, is that the credit rating agencies basically suffer from groupthink and massive conflicts of interest because they're paid by the people they rate. And they're not, and if you don't rate them very well, they're unlikely to pay you. So you have a very strong interest in the survival of the firm and in them liking you. It's a sort of, you couldn't make the conflict up more effectively if you were dreaming of it. So but that's the background to the credit rating agencies. When it comes to country risk, it's also a cartel. There are basically 3 credit rating agencies, and you need at least 2 of them to issue bonds on international markets. So it's a very well structured cartel arrangement, which we wouldn't normally allow in competitive markets. Be that as it may, they're powerful, and they determine their rating determines whether you have access to certain markets, and it also determines where pension fund, if you're issuing a bond, how it's priced, whether you can issue it and how it's going to be priced, and they also shape investment by pension funds and others, because pension funds, for example, are instructed that they can only invest in investment grade assets. That would be a prudent policy of a pension fund, that you have to only invest in investment grade, which you can't invest in what's called junk bonds or lower credit rating agencies below a BB, for example. So what happens in this is that countries are desperate not to be downgraded. South Africa's been through this recently. It wasn't successful in that because the price of the money you borrow goes up, and the amount of money you get that people invest in you, whether it's private investors or institutional investors, goes down. And so it's very bad for your economy. So it's an important thing. Now, what's happened is that countries have, and for countries, going to the market's important because it gives them access to a wider set of borrowers, but also because the firms in the country can only have a credit rating which is below what's called the country ceiling, or at the country ceiling. No firm in a country can be above the country, and that's important for countries. So many countries have gone to the market, worked very hard to show they're responsible and get their credit ratings. The reason I think it's wrong for credit ratings to be downgraded as a result of accepting concessional loans now is because this is an exceptional circumstance. These countries have been doing absolutely the right thing. They have not made mistakes on their macroeconomic policy. They're not being accused of corruption. They're not being accused of any of the other things that would normally lead to the downgrading of a credit rating. What they are suffering from is a total collapse of their economies for no fault of their own at all. A collapse of exports, a collapse of tourism, a collapse of remittances from migrant workers, a collapse of their currencies as everything becomes more expensive relative to foreign goods and services, including their debt. And of course, a collapse of their tax collection as the economy contracts and their tax collectors can't go and get more money from either individuals who are paying pay-as-you-earn taxes or from companies' corporate taxes. So none of those things are the fault of a government that's been doing all the right things, which is why I don't think it's fair to punish a government for those sorts of circumstances. Everyone's going through it. They are not punishing the rich countries who are printing money, whereas normally you'd think they should. Britain's credit rating has not collapsed. The US's credit rating has not collapsed. But they're punishing the countries who are the victims of this. And my view is that that could be resolved by the international institutions and community simply writing off the debt. That actually would make these countries far more viable for the long term, because it means instead of repaying debt, they'd be in a position to take on more debt and to spend the money that they would have spent on debt payments on their own citizens through education, through health, through infrastructure, and all the other things that government should be investing in. So this would be improving the credit rating of countries by reducing their debt burden, and instead it's being seen as undermining the credit rate, their position, and I think that that's very perverse on behalf of the credit rating agencies.
Great, thank you very much, Ian. I'm going to read two of the questions. One that we received in advance of the seminar, and another one which I think could be related to that. So the one that we received beforehand was from Simon Becker, who you know. He says, in a recent article, Fukuyama argues that the states that have best managed COVID are those that have a competent state apparatus, in brackets, not necessarily democratic. So a government whose citizens citizens trust and listen to, and effective leaders. Do you agree? And then let me add to that, as perhaps a flip side, the question from Vidya Nanjundia, from one of our fellows in India, who says, during the pandemic, governments have acting increasingly in an authoritarian manner. In your opinion, is this likely to lead to more inequalities and more repression within countries?
Okay, two very good questions, and it's nice to know that Simon's engaged in your seminars remotely. I read his books as a student and subsequently. I think there is certainly the case that governments that are more able and competent have done better, but I would place the emphasis on the second part of the question, which is about trust, rather than the first. And I think, you know, I don't agree that effective governments have necessarily done well. Now, if you compare across Europe, for example, it would be difficult to say that Greece has a much stronger government than the UK, for example, or France, in terms of the qualifications, the number, the skills, the normal effectiveness of its civil service. Indeed, in 2008-9, one of the reasons Greece was seen to be in a financial crisis was because of the weakness of its government systems and corruption levels of its government systems. At the same time, it's done so much better on COVID. And one could extend this argument to a place like Mongolia, which has a very weak government and very effective management of the pandemic. I agree that it's not autocratic versus democratic. We've seen democratic governments do incredibly well. I've just cited Greece, but many others, Australia, New Zealand have too. Many others, South Korea, Taiwan. And we've had autocratic governments do well. Vietnam, China, etc. We've had democratic governments do absolutely terribly. The US, the UK, Brazil, and we've had autocratic governments like Russia do absolutely terribly. So clearly, it's not about the political system as such. Although we have got a recent paper from the Oxford Martin School that suggests that on average, democracies have done better than autocracies. But it's about something about social trust and abiding by rules and other things. And there's also, we need to be clear, some luck in this. And that's why, you know, like with the measurement questions, one has to be very, correlation does not spell causation. A very basic rule of science and social sciences. And, you know, some countries were unlucky. Italy was unlucky. It basically hit Italy before it knew what was going on. Austria was also unlucky because it had one ski resort that became a super spreader for COVID. It was, you know, that was partly, it happened in the ski season. And some people came to that ski resort and suddenly they were a super spreading. So there is also luck, but I think social cohesion is absolutely vital, as I indicated, and the willingness of individuals to make sacrifice. And this goes back to the question on neoliberalism. My own sense is that what has really been challenged by the pandemic is this question of individualism, and whether our societies are composed of groups of individuals or whether there's something called society. Now, the famous Maggie Thatcher quote was, "There's no such thing as a society." Of course, the famous Theresa May quote is, "If you're a nation of everywhere, you're a nation. If you're a citizen of everywhere, you're a citizen of nowhere." Those two sort of symbols of individualism and nationalism, I think, have been severely challenged by the pandemic. What we're seeing is that actually social sacrifice is massively, and community is massively important. And it's no accident to me that the most individualistic of societies, the US, has done the worst. That the UK is probably the most individualistic in Europe, is sort of, you know, close to second worst. And that in many respects, the Brazilian individualism and populism is the worst in Latin America, followed by Chile, incidentally, which has also been one of the more neoliberal societies for a long period of time. So I think that is something which we need to reflect on. The question about authoritarianism, yes, we have seen you know, all sorts of invasions of privacy, authoritarianism. In the UK, we never thought the government would tell us how many people we could have to round to our house, or in South Africa, what time the bars were closing. If they were going to open in South Africa, you can't smoke or drink. You know, you couldn't at times. That massive invasion of personal liberties is global, with some exceptions like Sweden. And it certainly, I think, does lead to wider inequalities in some respects, because those that have the access and the means have the ability to carry on. You know, you don't need to go out into a park if you have a big garden. You don't need to rely on others in the same way if you can do things in your own home. If you have stores, something like 40% of people in Africa have no fridge. You know, the idea that you can't go out to the shop every day has a very different impact on them to it has of people that can just put things in the deep freeze and live very happily for months at an end. So it increases inequalities, I think, in many, many ways. Of course, some of these things, not all of them, were, I think, needed to slow the pandemic. And because the pandemic increases inequality, one could argue that lockdown in the long term reduces it in some respects. But my own view is that this has dramatically increased inequality. There's a message that that actually my screen wasn't shared on attitudes. Do you want me to put that up again?
You're welcome to put that up, Ian. It's I think we missed sharing that, so thanks.
Okay. I'll try and put it up again. Let's see. I've opened it here and I've clicked on it. Does that show up?
Great, we can see it now.
Okay, so what this slide is basically showing is attitudinal change, and the fact that in most countries, high 80s, 90s% of people, including South Africa, you see 91% of people in South Africa believe that change is necessary, that things shouldn't go back to what they were before. 66% of people feel that strongly, and another, in South Africa, 25 believe it modestly, but only 9% of people think that things should go back to what they were before. And this is a very global phenomenon. I was very struck by this. And finally, that was the other slide I put up, which is just my Twitter address and book information and website if you want to have that. All right, let's stop showing this again. Then stop sharing.
Thank you. Thanks, Ian.
Okay.
To the question from Johan Rover. He starts, first of all, thanking you for an extremely interesting and thought-provoking lecture. In your outline, you had a topic, the future of cities, which you haven't really dwelt on. You'd appreciate if you were to say a few words on that. Yeah.
It's obviously a massive topic in its own right, and there's a big section in Terra Incognita on cities and their future. The key question is, what does this pandemic do to that debate? And my own sense is that it's going to change the nature of cities quite dramatically. I think it's going to make them younger, because older people with families will tend to go out of city centers, and people that have to stay in cities because they have to be in work will remain in them. But a lot of the people that serviced offices will be losing very badly. So everything from security guards to cleaners to caterers, the shops nearby that gave people their lunchtime food, etc., formal and informal sector. And so that is going to, I believe, change the income distribution in cities, the house prices, etc. I think we will see a dramatic decline in office space prices. We'll find that cities for this medium term are overbuilt in terms of offices. Even if there was a 15 to 20% decline in the use of office space, that would affect the pricings quite dramatically. Now, this is going to be different in different sorts of places. You know, in a place like the UK or the US, many of the people that worked in these offices can go home and have a space to work at home, an office at home. But that's not true for younger people who are often in one-bedroom apartments and also live alone, and they will want to be in office spaces. And it's not true of, as well, I think, of people from poorer communities that live in work in cities. So this again will increase inequality. And I think what we'll see increasingly in the cities is single people, is younger people, and people that need to be there because they cannot, in a way, afford to be anywhere else, but less differentiation. A little bit further down the road, it also opens a very interesting question. If people are working remotely, why do they need to be in the same country? If I'm going to be a remote worker at Oxford University, why don't I just come and hang out at STIAS and Stellenbosch? And I think we'll see, and we already are seeing some of that globalization, but it'll happen in a more radical way. Why would you pay a lawyer or an architect or a professional in the city of London £100 an hour to do a job when you could get the same job done for £10 an hour in South Africa or in India or elsewhere? And I think we're going to see an internationalization of professional services as well as a result of this process. That again will undermine the strength of the main dynamic cities.
Thank you, Ian. So we're almost at 90 minutes, and I don't want to lose the opportunity to hear you just say a few words about the new book. What are these apps, and how will they guide us? If you could, in a few minutes.
Okay, so that's the book, and it's a big, heavy thing, so it's good for weight training as well. It's 1.9 kilos. It's a book which really is trying to visualize what's going on in the world. You know, Rob Maga, who lived in Rio, and I are very, very keen to try and communicate what's happening on globalization, on health, on development, on the climate change, on demography, on the future of cities, on all these key questions we all face. And yet, we find that more and more people just want quick sound bites, don't really have the time or the energy And the system is very, very complex. There's so much information of so many dimensions, all which intertwines. Very difficult to make sense and gain perspective. And so what we wanted to do was try and visualize that and represent it in new ways. And we have amazing potential for that with satellite maps, with new ways of visualization. And with this group we collaborated with at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh in the US, which are really state of the art on map making. So we did a lot of time series, what things look like in 1960 or 70, what they look like today, and what they're likely to look like in the future. And I think it'll wake people up. I hope that people will find it interesting. There's a lot of text in it as well. It's 500 pages. You can drill down. It's like whatever you're interested in, or many things you're interested in should be in there. But there's a lot of visualization. And just some of the maps, for example, if you look at what Miami is going to look like in the year 2100, I think that will be hopefully a wake-up call to people that live there, underwater. Same is true of Jakarta, Mumbai, and other places. It's bringing home to us these things and trying to represent in different ways the challenges. And as I say, I'm delighted that it's going to be available hopefully in South African bookshops in the next month or so.
Okay, super. Fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Ian. I think we've come to a good point to draw the webinar to a close. Ian, you know very well what will follow here. So an informal reception, where conversations will continue.
All I have is my water.
So while I gladly offer that invitation to those in the room here, we have to greet you and the rest of our online audience at this point. Thank you so much for.
Well, thanks to all of you. Stay healthy.
With us. Again, Ian, our deep gratitude for that really amazing, stark information and statistics, and your deep insight in interpreting what all this means for where we are. So I think we look forward to seeing you hopefully early next year, fingers crossed. So in the meantime, all the best for your work. Thanks again. I think by means of closing, let me turn the camera to the audience and we'll end with a final round of applause.
Thanks very much to all of you. It really has been a pleasure for me, and my heart is with you, and I hope to be with you physically as soon as conditions allow. But thanks to you all, and good luck, and stay safe and healthy.
Thank you. Same to you.
Okay, take care. Enjoy your drink.